Something is being built right now in the Middle East that most people in the West have not been told about. Not a building, not an oil pipeline, a military alliance, a defense pact between two of the most powerful Muslim nations on earth, with a third one about to join. And when that third country steps through the door, the entire balance of power across the Middle East, South Asia, and beyond will shift in a way that has not been seen in decades. The country knocking on that door is Turkey. The alliance waiting inside is Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. And what is emerging from these negotiations is something analysts are already calling the Islamic NATO. This is not a rumor. This is not a theory. In September of 2025, Saudi Arabia and Pakistan signed a formal mutual defense agreement in Riyadh. The agreement contains language that mirrors the most powerful clause in the NATO treaty. It states that any aggression against one member country is considered an act of aggression against all members. That single line changes everything. Because Pakistan is the world's only nuclear-armed Muslim nation, and Saudi Arabia just placed itself under that nuclear umbrella. Then in January 2026, Bloomberg reported that Turkey was in advanced talks to join that same pact. Sources familiar with the negotiations said a deal was very likely, and that talks had reached an advanced stage. Pakistan's Minister for Defense Production told Reuters that a draft agreement between all three countries had already been prepared. Three countries, one collective defense treaty, the second largest military in NATO, the Arab world's largest economy, and a nuclear arsenal. Stop and think about what that actually means. Turkey brings to this alliance the second largest standing military within the entire NATO structure. It has over 355,000 active military personnel. It has decades of real combat experience from Syria, Libya, Iraq, and Nagorno-Karabakh. It has a defense industry that now exports weapons to 178 countries, including NATO and European Union member states. In December 2024, Turkey sold 2 military supply ships to the Portuguese Navy and signed a deal with Spain for 24 Hurjet jet trainer aircraft, manufactured by Turkish Aerospace Industries. These are not just any planes. These are the first time in history that Turkey sold military aircraft to a NATO and EU member country. The country that was once dependent on Western weapons to defend itself is now selling those same Western allies their own military hardware. Saudi Arabia brings something entirely different. It brings money, and lots of it. The Saudi defense budget for 2025 reached $72.5 billion, a 5% increase from the previous year. Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 plan has set a bold target to localize 50% of all defense spending inside the kingdom by the year 2030. They were at 4% localization in 2018. By the end of 2023, they had pushed that number to nearly 20%. That is a dramatic leap. And they are not stopping. They want to build their own weapons, their own drones, their own warships, their own fighter jets. And they have chosen Turkey as the partner to help them get there. Pakistan brings the one thing Saudi Arabia has always wanted and never had: a nuclear deterrent. Saudi Arabia has no nuclear weapons. It never has. But for decades, Saudi leaders have quietly acknowledged that if Iran were ever to cross the nuclear threshold, Saudi Arabia would need a fast answer. Pakistan has always been seen as that answer. The two countries share deep religious, financial, and historical ties. Saudi Arabia financed Pakistan's nuclear program in the 1980s and 1990s, according to multiple intelligence assessments. The formal defense pact, signed in September 2025, does not explicitly mention nuclear weapons, but it does not have to. The message is clear to anyone reading between the lines. An attack on Saudi Arabia is an attack on Pakistan, and Pakistan has nuclear missiles. Now add Turkey to that equation. The question you have to ask is this: why is this happening right now? Why in 2025 and not 5 years ago? Why are these three countries, all of which maintain relationships with the United States, suddenly formalizing a defense structure that operates outside of Washington's control? The answer is a combination of betrayal, opportunity, and fear. And each of those three countries has a different version of the same story. For Saudi Arabia, the moment of reckoning came in 2019. In September of that year, Iranian drones and cruise missiles struck Aramco oil facilities at Abqaiq and Khurais. It was the largest attack on oil infrastructure in history. Nearly 5% of the world's daily oil supply was knocked offline in a single night. Saudi Arabia looked to Washington for a response. What it got was mild condemnation and symbolic troop deployments, no retaliation against Iran, no serious military consequence for the attack. The message that Saudi leadership took from that moment was painful but clear. When it comes to a direct military threat, America would not go to war for the kingdom. Then in 2025, the wound was reopened. Israel launched a strike targeting Hamas leadership inside Qatar. Qatar, a Gulf state. The strike shocked every government in the region. Gulf nations watched in horror as a military attack was carried out inside the territory of a fellow Arab country. Washington's response was, in the words of analysts, lukewarm. Once again, the Gulf states felt exposed. Once again, they felt that the American security guarantee was something written on paper, but not enforced in practice. Saudi Arabia had already been in quiet talks with Pakistan about a formal defense arrangement. After the Qatar incident, those talks accelerated into action. By September 2025, the agreement was signed. For Turkey, the motivation is different but equally powerful. Turkey has been a NATO member since 1952. It hosts American nuclear weapons at Incirlik Air Base. It is the second largest standing army in the entire alliance. And yet, in recent years, Turkey has been treated more like a problem than a partner. In 2019, Turkey purchased the Russian S-400 missile defense system, a decision driven by a legitimate national security need to have independent air defense capability. NATO was not providing Turkey with the systems it needed on terms Ankara could accept, so Turkey went to Russia. The punishment was immediate and severe. Washington kicked Turkey out of the F-35 stealth fighter jet program. Billions of dollars in contracts, technology, and aircraft that Turkey had been counting on simply disappeared overnight. That decision had consequences nobody in Washington fully calculated. Turkey was left with a gaping hole in its Air Force modernization plans, so it built its own, and Turkey is not stopping there. The defense relationship between Ankara and Riyadh goes far beyond buying and selling weapons. Turkey signed an executive plan for defense cooperation with Saudi Arabia in July 2023 during President Erdogan's visit to Riyadh. That plan was designed to elevate their relationship to the level of a full strategic partnership. Since then, there have been multiple memoranda of understanding signed, Saudi acquisitions of stakes in Turkish defense companies, and serious discussions about co-production arrangements. Saudi Arabia does not just want to buy Turkish weapons, it wants to learn how to build them. Turkey, for its part, sees in Saudi Arabia a partner with the money and the ambition to co-invest in major defense programs that Ankara could not fund alone. In December 2024, Saudi Arabia's Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Fayyad bin Hamad al-Ruwaili, traveled to Ankara at the invitation of his Turkish counterpart, General Metin Gurak. The two held individual meetings and joint sessions. Al-Ruwaili also met with Turkey's Minister of Defense. No official statement was released after those meetings. When governments do not release statements after high-level military meetings, it means the conversations were serious. It means what they discussed was too significant, too sensitive, or too incomplete to be shared publicly. The drone story is central to understanding how this partnership actually works on the ground. Turkey's Baykar Industries produces two drones that have changed the nature of warfare. The Bayraktar TB2 became globally famous after Turkey deployed it in Syria, Libya, and Azerbaijan, where it proved devastatingly effective against conventional military hardware. Tanks, air defense systems, artillery installations, the TB2 destroyed them from altitudes and distances that made counterattack nearly impossible. The larger and more capable Akinci drone followed, capable of carrying heavier payloads, flying longer missions, and operating at higher altitudes. Saudi Arabia has been acquiring these systems. In 2025, Saudi Arabia was set to receive Akinci drones from Baykar, with co-production ventures under active discussion. This is not just a transaction. Saudi Arabia wants to manufacture these drones on Saudi soil. Turkey wants to help it do that. This is what a genuine defense partnership looks like. Now zoom out and look at what is actually being assembled here. Saudi Arabia's financial power, Turkey's military experience, industrial capacity, and the sheer size of its armed forces, Pakistan's nuclear deterrent, and it's one of the largest standing armies in the world. These three countries together represent something that did not exist before September 2025. They represent a security architecture for the Muslim world that is independent of Washington, independent of NATO, and capable of making its own strategic decisions. Analysts and think tanks are using a term that sounds dramatic but is increasingly accurate. They're calling it the Muslim NATO. The parallel is not perfect, but the core logic is the same. Just as NATO was built on the principle that an attack on one member triggers the collective defense of all members, the Strategic Mutual Defense Agreement between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan contains exactly that clause. An attack on one is an attack on all. When Turkey joins, and every credible source says that is a matter of when, not if, that collective defense commitment will extend across three of the most strategically located countries in the world. Look at the geography of this alliance, and it becomes even more striking. Turkey sits at the intersection of Europe, the Middle East, and Central Asia. It controls the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits, the only maritime passage between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Any naval movement from Russia's Black Sea fleet into the broader ocean must pass through Turkish-controlled waters. Turkey also shares borders with Greece, Bulgaria, Georgia, Armenia, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. It is the land bridge between continents. Pakistan sits at the crossroads of South Asia, Central Asia, and the Middle East. It borders Iran, Afghanistan, India, and China. It controls mountain passes and trade routes that have been strategically contested for centuries. Saudi Arabia sits at the heart of the Arabian Peninsula, controlling the Red Sea coast, the the Persian Gulf approaches, and the world's largest proven oil reserves. 3 countries, 3 strategic choke points, 1 mutual defense commitment. The United States is watching this with significant unease, but also with a degree of confusion, because these are all American allies. Turkey is a NATO member. Saudi Arabia has been Washington's primary Arab partner for 8 decades. Pakistan has cooperated with American military operations across South Asia for decades. The question Washington is now grappling with is how 3 of its closest partners in the Muslim world ended up building a security structure that bypasses American oversight entirely. Part of the answer lies in what happened to America's credibility in the region over the past decade. The 2019 Aramco attack that went unanswered. The 2021 withdrawal from Afghanistan that shocked every American ally in the region. The 2025 Qatar incident that triggered the original Saudi-Pakistan pact. But part of the answer also lies in the changing calculations of Erdogan, Mohammed bin Salman, and the Pakistani military establishment. All 3 governments have concluded that in an era of shifting American priorities, it is better to have additional security frameworks than to rely on Washington as the sole guarantor. Erdogan has been particularly deliberate about this. Turkey under Erdogan has simultaneously applied for EU membership, sought observer status in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, expanded trade with Russia and China, and now moved toward a mutual defense pact with Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. Turkey's trade with China grew from $6.7 billion in 2002 to $101 billion in 2024. That is not a country pivoting away from the West. That is a country that has decided to maintain relationships in every direction simultaneously. Erdogan calls this strategic autonomy. His critics call it strategic ambiguity. But whatever you call it, the results speak for themselves. Turkey is now simultaneously inside NATO, negotiating a deal to rejoin the F-35 program, building its own stealth fighter, arming the Muslim world's newest defense alliance, and expanding trade with countries Washington considers adversaries. The Can fighter jet deserves more attention here, because it is not just a weapon system. It is a symbol. When Turkey was expelled from the F-35 program, the conventional wisdom in Washington was that Ankara would be forced to choose. Either come back into compliance, abandon the S-400 and be welcomed back into the program, or face permanent exclusion from the most advanced military aviation technology in the West. Turkey chose a third option that Washington did not anticipate. It chose to build something better than what it was being denied. The KN is not just technologically competitive with the F-35. It comes without the political conditions. It comes without the sanctions threat. It comes without the American government's ability to cut off software updates, maintenance contracts, or spare parts as political leverage. When Saudi Arabia looks at that deal and considers buying 100 KN jets, it is not just buying an aircraft. It is buying the ability to have an advanced air force that Washington cannot switch off with a phone call. After what happened in 2022 when the United States halted sales of precision-guided munitions to Saudi Arabia to pressure Riyadh over the Yemen war, Riyadh understands exactly what it means to be dependent on an arms supplier that can cut you off. The lesson was painful and lasting. Turkey offers something Washington never will, weapons with no political strings attached. Now consider what Israel makes of all this. The answer is, Israel is watching with alarm. The deepening military relationship between Turkey and Saudi Arabia sits at the intersection of almost every strategic concern Israel has right now. Turkey under Erdogan has been one of Israel's most vocal and hostile critics since the Gaza war began. Erdogan has compared Israeli military actions in Gaza to the Holocaust. Turkey imposed a full trade embargo on Israel. Turkey actively supported Turkish-backed forces in Syria that toppled the Assad government in December 2024, bringing Turkish military influence to Israel's northern doorstep. Turkey is now planning to build a permanent military base in central Syria, and Israel has expressed strong opposition to that base. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia, which was on the verge of normalizing relations with Israel in a historic deal brokered by Washington, has made Palestinian statehood a non-negotiable precondition for any normalization. As long as Israel refuses to commit to a credible path toward Palestinian statehood, Saudi Arabia will not normalize. Both Turkey and Saudi Arabia have converged on the same position. The two-state solution is the only acceptable outcome. Both are applying pressure on Washington to deliver that outcome, and both are building military partnerships that give them leverage over that pressure. The Syria factor is critical and often overlooked. The fall of Bashar al-Assad's government in December 2024 created a power vacuum in one of the most strategically important countries in the Middle East. Turkey, which had backed the rebel forces that ultimately prevailed, found itself in a position of extraordinary influence in a post-Assad Syria. Turkish military forces remain in northwestern Syria. A defense pact between Turkey and the new Syrian government is under active negotiation. Turkey is planning a military base in Syria, and Saudi Arabia has expressed satisfaction with the new Syrian political order. The two countries are aligned on Syria in a way they have never been before. This Syrian alignment matters for the broader alliance because Syria is the land bridge between Turkey and the Arab world. Control over Syrian territory, or at least significant influence over it, gives Turkey a physical corridor to the Gulf. Turkey has been developing what analysts call the Turkish corridor, a strategic route for energy, goods, and military coordination linking the Gulf to Europe through Turkish-controlled territory. There are active discussions about a Qatari-Turkish gas pipeline through Syria, connecting to the Arab gas pipeline, which could give Europe an alternative energy route that bypasses both Russian pipelines and Israeli-Greek alternatives. The military and economic dimensions of this alliance are inseparable. The nuclear dimension hangs over everything, like a cloud that everyone sees but no one wants to name directly. Pakistan's nuclear arsenal currently includes an estimated 170 nuclear warheads, according to the Arms Control Association. Pakistan has ballistic missiles capable of reaching distances that cover Iran, and that stretch as far as southern Russia. When Saudi Arabia signed the Mutual Defense Pact with Pakistan and agreed that an attack on one is an attack on all, every government in the region understood what that language actually meant in nuclear terms. Saudi Arabia has never said it is seeking a nuclear deterrent through Pakistan. Pakistan has never said it would extend nuclear protection to Saudi Arabia, but the architecture of the pact makes the implicit message unavoidable. This has triggered concern in Washington, not just about regional stability, but about nuclear non-proliferation. Any suggestion that Pakistan's nuclear deterrent could extend to Saudi Arabia, even informally, creates a scenario where nuclear weapons become a regional security tool in the most volatile part of the world. It creates incentives for Iran to accelerate whatever nuclear activities remain after its recent setbacks. It creates incentives for other regional powers to seek their own nuclear arrangements. The domino logic of nuclear proliferation is exactly what arms control frameworks have spent decades trying to prevent, and it is now being tested in real time. There are legitimate debates about whether Turkey actually benefits from formalizing this alliance. Some Turkish analysts argue that Turkey already has everything the Muslim NATO offers, and more. Turkey is inside NATO and already has the protection of American and British nuclear weapons under Article 5. Turkish missiles do not reach all of Turkey's potential adversaries in Europe, and entering a formal defense pact with Saudi Arabia and Pakistan could create situations where Turkey is obligated to respond militarily to conflicts in South Asia, or the Gulf that have nothing to do with Turkish national interests. There are also questions about whether a formal alliance creates complications for Turkey's NATO membership. Can a country be simultaneously inside NATO and inside a separate mutual defense structure that could, in theory, conflict with NATO's priorities? But Erdogan's answer to all of that is strategic leverage. Turkey is not joining this alliance because it needs military protection. Turkey is joining because it dramatically increases Ankara's bargaining power everywhere else. When Turkey threatens to withhold cooperation within NATO, when it negotiates terms for rejoining the F-35 program, when it pushes back against European pressure on any number of issues, having an alternative defense architecture in its back pocket gives Turkey options that no other NATO member possesses. It is the same logic that drove Turkey to buy the S-400 in the first place. Not because Turkey needed the weapon as much as Russia offered it, but because the act of buying it forced a negotiation that Turkey wanted to have. The economic dimension of this alliance is just as important as the military one. Saudi Arabia and Turkey's bilateral trade reached $7.9 billion in 2025. That number was a fraction of that just a few years earlier. Saudi Arabia is now becoming one of the most important markets for Turkish defense exports. The $6 billion arms deal already signed between the two countries includes unmanned aerial vehicles, tanks, and warships. The potential deal for 100 Ka-N stealth fighter jets would add an extraordinary amount on top of that. For Turkey, which has been struggling with currency depreciation and economic headwinds, including inflation that has run above 25% and unemployment rising above 8.5%, the Saudi defense market is a vital lifeline. Every $1 billion in defense exports to Riyadh is $1 billion that strengthens the Turkish lira, employs Turkish engineers and factory workers, and builds the industrial base that Erdogan has made the centerpiece of his vision for a self-sufficient Turkey. For Saudi Arabia, the calculus is equally strategic. Vision 2030 is not just an economic reform plan. It is a national identity project. Mohammed bin Salman is trying to transform Saudi Arabia from an oil-dependent monarchy that outsources its security to a self-sufficient modern state that can project power on its own terms. Building a domestic defense industry is central to that vision. Saudi Arabia cannot achieve that by only buying weapons. It needs to understand how to build them. Turkey, which went from importing nearly all of its military hardware in the early 2000s to building stealth fighters and exporting arms to 178 countries by 2025, is the perfect teacher. The Saudi-Turkish defense partnership is not just a transaction. It is a technology transfer. It is a knowledge transfer. It is a partnership in industrial ambition. And then there's the role of Pakistan, which is easy to overlook but impossible to ignore. Pakistan brings to this alliance not just nuclear weapons, but a military that is battle-tested, large, and deeply professional. Pakistan has one of the largest armies in the world, with over 600,000 active personnel. It has a missile program that has been developing independently for decades. It has deep intelligence relationships across the Muslim world, and it has most recently demonstrated its willingness to use those assets in an aligned way. When India and Pakistan had a brief but intense military confrontation in 2025, Turkey blocked the transit of Indian military equipment through Turkish airspace. That was not a coincidence. That was coordination. Turkey was already acting as though the alliance existed before it was formally signed. The India reaction to all of this is another piece of the strategic picture that matters. India has watched the Turkey-Pakistan alignment with growing concern. India has expressed formal concern about the emerging trilateral defense structure. The possibility that Turkey could formalize a defense commitment with Pakistan, India's nuclear-armed adversary at a time when Indo-Pakistani tensions remain high, is a factor that New Delhi cannot ignore. It changes the risk calculus for any future confrontation, and it adds another layer to the already complicated geometry of great power competition in Asia. China is the quiet architect in this whole picture. Pakistan already relies on China for the overwhelming majority of its weapons imports. In 2024, 81% of Pakistan's arms imports came from China. China has embedded private military contractors, intelligence operatives from the Ministry of State Security, and Belt and Road infrastructure across Pakistan. Pakistan has become, in the eyes of multiple Western intelligence assessments, a listening post for Beijing inside one of the world's most strategically sensitive regions. Now consider what happens when Pakistan joins a formal defense pact with Saudi Arabia and Turkey, and Saudi Arabia is simultaneously acquiring both American F-35s and Pakistani-Chinese JF-17 aircraft for its air force. You've created a scenario where Chinese intelligence, operating through Pakistani relationships, moves one step closer to America's most sensitive military technology. Washington's national security establishment understands this, and it is one of the reasons why the reaction from American officials to the emerging Muslim NATO has been more complicated than simple endorsement or simple rejection. Turkey still wants back into the F-35 program, and Trump has indicated openness to that. Saudi Arabia still wants American weapons and American security commitments, but the architecture these countries are building between themselves is increasingly independent of American permission. That independence is the whole point. What we are witnessing is a fundamental restructuring of the security landscape in the world's most volatile region. The old framework, where America was the indispensable guarantor of stability across the Middle East, South Asia, and the broader Muslim world, is being replaced by something new, not by China, not by Russia, by the Muslim world itself. By countries that grew tired of waiting for security guarantees that never fully arrived, that grew frustrated with weapons deals that came with political conditions, and that grew ambitious enough to imagine an alternative. The Strategic Mutual Defense Agreement between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, with Turkey on the verge of joining, is the most concrete expression of that new reality. It is not perfect. It is not without contradictions. It creates obligations that may one day conflict with other commitments these countries have made. It raises questions about nuclear proliferation that no one has answered yet. It challenges NATO's coherence in ways that Washington has not fully processed. But it is real. It is being built in real time. And its consequences will unfold across the entire global order for years, possibly decades, to come. The next time you hear someone say that Turkey and Saudi Arabia used to be rivals who barely trusted each other, remember this. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman visited Ankara in June 2022, his first visit to Turkey after the killing of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. That visit broke the ice. Erdogan visited Riyadh in July 2023 and signed the executive plan for defense cooperation. In 2024 alone, the Saudi-Turkish Joint Military Committee held 3 separate sessions. Saudi Arabia's chief of staff visited Ankara in December 2024. By January 2026, Turkey was in advanced talks to formalize a collective defense pact that binds its military to Saudi Arabia and Pakistan under the same commitment that anchors the NATO alliance. An attack on one is an attack on all. That is not rivalry. That is an alliance. And it is changing the world right now.